tiny hamsters lost their mother and grow up with a dog. Their bond will melt your heart. The skies over Maplewood had been threatening all day. Gray clouds transformed into an ominous wall of darkness by mid-afternoon. Weather alerts buzzed on phones throughout the small town, warning of an approaching storm system unlike any they'd seen in years. In a small garden shed behind the Thompson residence, nestled within the cracked wall where an old wooden beam met the foundation, a mother hamster named Peanut had just finished creating a perfect nest for her 3 newborn pups. They were tiny, pink, and helpless, their eyes still sealed shut against the world. The mother hamster had lined the nest with soft bits of cotton, pieces of dried grass, and even a few strands of dog fur she'd found while foraging. Peanut's whiskers twitched nervously as she sensed the change in air pressure. Her instincts told her something wasn't right. With gentle nudges, she repositioned her babies deeper into the nest before venturing out to gather additional supplies. Her maternal instinct drove her to prepare for whatever was coming. As she slipped out of the small opening at the base of the shed, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the garden in brief, harsh flashes. Thunder followed almost immediately, the sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath her tiny paws. Mrs. Thompson, a kindly widow in her 60s, peered anxiously out her kitchen window. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, far worse than the forecasters had predicted. The trees in her backyard bent at alarming angles, branches whipping violently in the wind. "I should have had that tree trimmed last fall," she murmured to herself, jumping as another flash of lightning lit up the sky. Peanut was fighting against the wind and rain, determined to return to her babies. The tiny hamster's fur was soaked through, her body temperature dropping dangerously. She had found a seed and a bit of forgotten birdseed, clutched tightly in her cheek pouches. Just a little further to the shed, to safety, to her pups who needed her. Inside the house, Mrs. Thompson gasped as she heard a tremendous cracking sound. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched in horror as a massive branch from the old oak tore away from the trunk, heading directly toward her garden shed. "Oh no!" she cried out as the branch crashed through the shed roof with a splintering crunch that was audible even over the howling wind and thunder. Outside, Peanut had almost reached the safety of the shed when the branch came down. The impact sent debris flying in all directions. A piece of splintered wood struck the tiny creature, sending her tumbling across the muddy ground. Pain exploded through her small body as she tried desperately to get back to her feet. Her babies needed her. They would die without her warmth, her milk, her protection. With the last of her strength, Peanut dragged herself toward the shed, driven by pure maternal instinct. But the injury was too severe. As the rain continued to pour down mercilessly, the small creature's movements grew slower until finally, she lay still in a puddle that grew steadily pinker with her blood. Inside the Thompson residence, the elderly woman anxiously waited for the storm to pass, unaware of the small tragedy unfolding in her backyard. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in her favorite armchair, worrying about the damage she would find when daylight came. The storm raged on for hours. In the damaged shed, water began to seep through the broken roof. The beam near Peanut's nest shifted, allowing cold air and moisture to penetrate the once cozy home. The 3 tiny hamster pups, blind and hairless, huddled together instinctively, their little bodies trembling from the cold. They squeaked weakly, their cries for their mother going unanswered. Without her warmth and protection, their body temperatures began to drop dangerously. Their soft peeps grew more feeble with each passing hour as the storm continued to rage around them. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed, though rain still fell steadily. Mrs. Thompson, who had dozed fitfully in her chair through the night, awoke with a start to find the power was out. Her garden looked like a war zone. The old oak had lost several large branches, her flower beds were destroyed, and the shed was partially collapsed on one side. "Oh dear," she sighed, shaking her head. "What a mess." As daylight strengthened, revealing more of the storm's destruction, another drama was unfolding. In an alley 2 streets over, a large golden retriever with sad eyes and a dirty, matted coat was picking his way through debris washed up by the storm. Once beloved and well cared for, Max had been abandoned when his family moved away 3 months ago. They had simply left him behind, as if forgetting a piece of furniture. Neighbors had tried to catch him, to help him, but the trauma of abandonment had made him wary of human hands. He survived on scraps and whatever he could find, growing thinner but maintaining a gentle spirit. The storm had destroyed the makeshift shelter he'd been using beneath a neighbor's deck, forcing him to search for a new place to call home. His golden coat was muddy and plastered to his body as he padded along, nose to the ground. He was hungry and exhausted from a night spent trying to stay out of the worst of the storm. Back in the Thompson yard, inside the damaged shed, the hamster pups' situation grew dire. They were severely dehydrated and hypothermic, their tiny bodies using what little energy remained to maintain essential functions. Without their mother's milk, starvation would claim them soon, if the cold didn't take them first. Their weak squeaks had almost stopped entirely, a sign that they were slipping away. The world is full of small tragedies that go unnoticed, tiny lives that begin and end without fanfare or witness. The loss of a mother hamster and her soon-to-follow orphans would ordinarily be such a case, natural, if sad, and ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme. But sometimes fate has different plans. Sometimes, the most unexpected encounters can change everything. As the morning progressed and the rain finally stopped, Max continued his search for shelter. His sensitive nose picked up countless scents washed fresh by the rain as he wandered without direction, simply looking for somewhere dry where he might rest. His aimless journey brought him to the edge of Mrs. Thompson's property. The damaged shed caught his attention. Perhaps there might be a corner still dry enough to provide shelter. The door hung partially open, its hinges twisted by the impact of the fallen branch. Max approached cautiously, sniffing the air. And then he froze, his ears perking up. Among the many scents, there was something else. Something small, vulnerable, and fading fast. He tilted his head, listening intently. There, almost too faint to detect, a series of tiny, desperate squeaks. Max stepped forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, drawn by a sound that few others would have noticed, but that would change everything for a trio of orphaned hamster pups clinging to life. Max's ears twitched forward as he cautiously approached the source of the squeaking. The golden retriever moved with surprising gentleness, stepping carefully over fallen boards and shattered clay pots inside the damaged shed. His nose led him to the wall, where a beam had shifted during the storm. The desperate squeaks were coming from a small nest tucked into the crevice. Max sniffed intently, detecting the faint smell of death nearby. The mother hamster's body lay just outside the shed, but also the distinct scent of life, fragile though it might be. With surprising precision, Max nudged aside some debris covering the nest. 3 tiny pink forms huddled together in a desperate attempt to preserve warmth. Their eyes were still closed, their bodies nearly hairless, their tiny paws clutching at nothing. Something stirred deep within Max as he gazed at the orphan pups. Perhaps it was his own abandonment that created a kinship with these helpless creatures, or perhaps it was simply his gentle nature. Whatever the reason, Max knew he couldn't leave them to die. The decision went against every natural instinct. Dogs weren't meant to care for hamsters. In the wild, they might even be predators. But Max was no ordinary dog, and these were extraordinary circumstances. The hamster pups were growing weaker by the minute. Max lowered his head, his warm breath washing over the tiny creatures. They stirred slightly at the sudden warmth, their squeaking becoming momentarily more animated. With extreme care, Max opened his mouth and gently picked up all 3 pups together. He held them cushioned against his soft tongue, making sure not to press too hard. His saliva would help keep them warm for the journey, though he had no idea where he was taking them. As Max emerged from the shed, Mrs. Thompson had come outside to inspect the damage, clipboard in hand as she made notes for her insurance company. She was so focused on documenting the fallen tree branch that she didn't notice the golden retriever slipping along the fence line, his precious cargo safely tucked in his mouth. Max needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere dry and warm. He remembered a small gap under another shed a few houses down, one that was undamaged by the storm. It was where he sometimes sheltered when it rained. Moving with purpose, Max trotted carefully through backyards and side streets, avoiding puddles and fallen debris. Each step was measured to minimize jostling his fragile passengers. The pups had fallen silent, conserving what little energy they had left. Upon reaching the shed, Max ducked into the small space beneath it. It was cramped but clean and dry. He had lined it with discarded newspapers and an old towel he found weeks ago, creating a makeshift bed for himself. With the same gentle precision, Max deposited the 3 hamster pups onto the softest part of the towel. They squirmed weakly, clearly distressed at being moved and separated from their nest. Their tiny bodies were cool to the touch, their movements growing more feeble by the minute. Max knew instinctively that they needed warmth more than anything. He curled his body around the pups, creating a protective semicircle. Then, using his nose, he carefully nudged the tiny creatures against his belly, where his fur was softest and his body warmest. The hamster pups, driven by blind instinct, snuggled against the warmth. Max lay his head down, his brown eyes watching the tiny pink forms with an intensity that spoke of his commitment. He would protect these orphans. He would keep them safe. But warmth alone wouldn't be enough. The pups needed nourishment. Their mother's milk was irreplaceable. Max had no way to feed them, and his canine brain struggled with this problem. All he could do for now was keep them warm and hope that it would be enough. As the day progressed, Max remained vigilant. He left the pups only once, and briefly, to lap water from a puddle outside. When he returned, he was relieved to find the pups still alive, though barely. Their tiny bodies rose and fell with shallow breaths, fighting against the odds. As evening approached, Max faced a dilemma. The pups needed food, and soon. He needed to find something that might sustain them. But leaving them alone for too long might finish them as quickly as starvation. Fortune sometimes favors the desperate. A familiar scent wafted toward him, the remains of someone's discarded hamburger, tossed into a nearby trash can after what was likely a post-storm cleanup. Max's stomach growled painfully, but he wasn't thinking of himself. With a new sense of determination, Max gently picked up the pups once more and carried them with him as he sought out the source of the smell. The trash can was at the edge of a driveway 2 houses away. Max set the pups down momentarily in a sheltered spot beneath a bush, then quickly knocked over the can with his paw. Among the contents was a half-eaten burger still in its wrapper. Max devoured it in 2 bites, his hunger momentarily sated. With his belly full, he picked up the pups again and returned to their shelter beneath the shed. Once they were safely ensconced in the towel nest, Max began to work methodically. He regurgitated a small portion of the hamburger he'd just eaten, a behavior used by mother dogs to feed their puppies when they're beginning to wean. The partially digested food was soft and warm. Max used his tongue to carefully separate the tiniest portions, then gently nudged these morsels toward the pups' mouths. To his relief, the first hamster pup, the largest of the 3, responded to the touch of food. Tiny jaws worked reflexively, taking in a minuscule amount of the offering. The other 2 soon followed suit, instinct driving them to accept nourishment in whatever form it came. It wasn't ideal, far from it. But it contained moisture and nutrients, and it was their only chance. As night fell, the golden retriever settled down with his unlikely charges. The hamster pups, having received their first meal since losing their mother, seemed marginally stronger. Their breathing had steadied somewhat, and they huddled together against Max's warm fur. Max rested his head on his paws, his eyes never leaving the tiny creatures he had saved. A strange feeling washed over him, something he hadn't felt since his family had abandoned him. It was a sense of purpose, of being needed. In the distance, someone called out a name, probably searching for a pet displaced by the storm. Max's ears perked up momentarily, then relaxed. That wasn't his name they were calling. No one was looking for him anymore. But these tiny lives depended on him now. As the golden retriever drifted into an uneasy sleep, he had no way of knowing that this day marked the beginning of something remarkable, an unlikely bond that would change not only his life but also the lives of 3 orphaned hamster pups who had found an unexpected protector in the storm's aftermath. 2 weeks after the storm, the landscape of Maplewood had begun to heal. Fallen trees had been cleared, damaged roofs patched, and power restored. Life was returning to normal for most residents, including Mrs. Thompson, whose garden shed had been repaired by a local handyman. What Mrs. Thompson didn't know was that her backyard had become home to a most unusual family. The golden retriever she occasionally spotted lounging in the sunshine was far more than just a neighborhood stray. Max had moved his little charges from their temporary shelter to a more permanent home, a dry, secluded space beneath Mrs. Thompson's newly repaired shed. The 3 hamster pups had defied all odds under Max's devoted care. No longer pink and hairless, they now sported downy brown fur that grew thicker each day. Their eyes had opened, revealing curious black beads that took in the world with wonder. Max had continued to feed them regurgitated food, supplemented by the softest parts of vegetables and fruits he managed to scavenge. Mrs. Thompson, a kind soul with a soft spot for animals, had begun leaving bowls of food and water on her back porch after noticing Max's frequent appearances. "Poor thing must be hungry," she would mutter to herself. She had considered trying to catch him, but there was something about his determined independence that gave her pause. What she couldn't see was how Max would carefully carry portions of that food back to the shed, where 3 eager hamsters waited for their share. Max had become remarkably adept at providing for his unusual family, dividing food into hamster-sized portions with his teeth and tongue. The pups, whom Max had mentally named Peanut, Butter, and Jelly in tribute to their mother, were growing more adventurous by the day. They no longer required the constant warmth of Max's body, though they still slept curled against his belly at night. Peanut, the largest and boldest of the 3, was the first to climb onto Max's back one sunny afternoon. The golden retriever lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight beside the shed, dozing lightly. With determined little paws, Peanut scaled the mountain of golden fur, leaving tiny footprints in Max's coat. Max opened one eye lazily, feeling the ticklish sensation of tiny claws against his skin. He remained perfectly still as Peanut reached his shoulder blade and paused, surveying the world from this new vantage point. Butter and Jelly soon followed their siblings' example. Max found himself hosting 3 tiny explorers as they scampered across his back, occasionally tumbling down his sides in clumsy descents that never discouraged them from trying again. Over the following days, Max's body became their playground. They would burrow into his thick fur, pop out unexpectedly from behind his ears, or cling to his tail as he walked. Max bore it all with astonishing patience, moving carefully to ensure none of his tiny charges would fall. The hamsters were developing behaviors that might have puzzled a biologist. Instead of the typical scurrying motions of their species, they began to mimic Max's movements. When he stretched, they would extend their tiny bodies in similar fashion. When he pawed at the ground before settling down, they would scratch at the earth with their front paws in miniature imitation. Most remarkable was their response to potential threats. Max had taught them, without conscious intention, to freeze and remain silent when he tensed at an unfamiliar sound or scent. This behavior, so unlike the panic squeaking typical of their kind, had already saved them from detection when curious neighborhood children had wandered near. As May turned to June, Mrs. Thompson began spending more time in her garden. Max and his hamster family would watch her from the safety of tall grass or bushes, the dog instinctively keeping his charges out of sight. Mrs. Thompson often spoke to Max when she spotted him. "Hello there, handsome. Still hanging around, I see? You know, you could come inside if you wanted. Get a proper bath and a comfortable bed." Max would wag his tail politely but never approach too closely. His responsibility to the hamsters outweighed any desire for human comfort. Their tiny lives had become the center of his world. One warm afternoon, Mrs. Thompson fell asleep in her garden chair, a book open on her lap. Max cautiously emerged to investigate a bowl of fresh water she had left for him. The hamsters were supposed to be napping in their nest. Or so Max thought. As he lapped at the water, a flash of movement caught his eye. To his horror, Peanut had followed him and was now scampering across the open lawn, heading straight for Mrs. Thompson's sleeping form. Max froze, torn between rushing after the adventurous hamster and potentially drawing attention to them all. But Peanut, driven by curiosity and an unusual fearlessness, continued toward the human. With a barely audible whine, Max crept forward, trying to intercept his wayward charge without waking Mrs. Thompson. But he was too late. Peanut scaled the side of the chair and made it onto Mrs. Thompson's lap, drawn by the colorful cover of her book. Max held his breath, muscles tense and ready to spring if the human made any threatening move. But Mrs. Thompson slept on, unaware of the small visitor investigating her floral-patterned dress. After what seemed like an eternity, Peanut decided to return, scampering down the chair and across the lawn. Max quickly guided the hamster back to the safety of their home with gentle nudges of his nose, his heart still racing from the close call. That evening, Max kept the hamsters closer than usual. The incident had reminded him of the precarious nature of their situation. Humans might not understand or accept their unusual bond. Yet despite these concerns, there was an undeniable joy in their strange family unit. The hamsters no longer saw Max as just a source of food and warmth, but as their leader, protector, and friend. They followed him with complete trust, responding to subtle cues in his body language. For his part, Max had found healing in this unexpected responsibility. The hole left by his former family's abandonment had been filled by the unconditional trust of 3 tiny creatures who needed him. As darkness fell, Max curled protectively around his sleeping charges. Butter and Jelly were already fast asleep, but Peanut remained awake, tiny paws grooming Max's fur in a gesture that seemed almost like gratitude. In the house, Mrs. Thompson looked out at her garden, now silvered by moonlight. "I'll win you over eventually," she murmured with a smile, unaware that Max's heart already belonged to a family she couldn't see, 3 tiny hamsters who were changing him in ways neither human nor dog could have anticipated. July arrived with a sweltering heat wave. The lush green lawns of Maplewood began to turn brown as the sun beat down relentlessly. For Max and his hamster family, the heat presented new challenges. Their shelter beneath the shed became stifling during peak afternoon hours, forcing them to adapt their routines. They now slept through the hottest part of the day and became active during cooler mornings and evenings. Max had dug a shallow depression in the earth where the hamsters could stay cooler, and he made frequent trips to Mrs. Thompson's water bowl, returning with a mouthful to deposit near their home. The hamsters had continued to thrive under Max's care. At 3 months old, they were now fully grown, their bodies covered in luxurious golden brown fur that resembled Max's own coat. Peanut, Butter, and Jelly had developed distinct personalities that amused and sometimes challenged their canine guardian. Peanut remained the boldest, often venturing farther than Max thought prudent. Butter was the peacemaker, intervening when the other 2 squabbled. Jelly, the smallest, was the most observant, often the first to notice changes in their environment. One hot evening, Max led his charges on their usual excursion around Mrs. Thompson's yard. Mrs. Thompson was inside, visible through the kitchen window as she prepared dinner. The yard seemed secure, and Max relaxed his guards slightly. Jelly, who was leading the tiny procession along the fence line, suddenly froze. The hamster's small body tensed, whiskers quivering with alertness. Max immediately noticed the change and lifted his nose to the air, testing for unfamiliar scents. There was the musky odor of a neighborhood cat. Max's body tensed as he scanned the yard. The other hamsters also froze in place, becoming almost invisible against the garden's edge. From behind Mrs. Thompson's hydrangea bush, a sleek gray form emerged. It was Slate, a well-fed cat belonging to the neighbors across the street, known for his hunting prowess. Max took a protective step toward his hamsters, but before he could act further, something unprecedented happened. Jelly emitted a high-pitched squeak. It wasn't the panic sound of a terrified rodent, but rather a deliberate, almost commanding noise. The moment the sound left Jelly's mouth, Peanut and Butter darted to the sides, creating distance between themselves. The strategic movement wasn't random. They had positioned themselves like points in a triangle, with the cat at its center. Max remained still. This wasn't the chaotic fear response of prey animals. This was something else entirely. The hamsters were communicating, coordinating. Slate focused on Jelly. The cat's body lowered into a hunting crouch, tail twitching in anticipation. As he began to stalk forward, Peanut let out another sharp squeak from the opposite direction. Slate's head whipped around, momentarily confused. This moment of confusion was all Max needed. With a deep, rumbling growl, he launched himself toward the intruding cat. Max wasn't trying to harm Slate, merely to scare him away, but the sudden appearance of 90 pounds of growling dog was more than enough. Slate yowled in surprise before streaking across the yard. He cleared the fence in one fluid motion, vanishing into the neighbor's yard. Through the kitchen window, Mrs. Thompson paused in her dinner preparations. She'd witnessed the entire exchange and stood transfixed. Had those tiny creatures actually worked together with the stray dog to chase away the neighbor's cat? That's impossible, she murmured to herself. But what she had seen was clear. The golden retriever had reacted to the hamster's squeaks as if they were communicating. Outside, Max led his family back toward the safety of their shed home, but his step had a new lightness to it. The hamsters had demonstrated that they weren't simply dependents, they were partners. They had warned him of danger just as surely as he protected them. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson found herself watching Max more closely. The golden retriever was lounging near the shed, seemingly alone. She approached slowly with a bowl of fresh kibble. "Good morning, handsome," she called softly. "I've got something special for you today." She set down the bowl about 10 feet from the shed and retreated to her garden chair, pretending to focus on her crossword puzzle while actually watching the dog. As Max rose and padded toward the food bowl, something small and brown darted out from beneath the shed. Mrs. Thompson blinked, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, there it was again. A small rodent, followed quickly by 2 others, all moving with purpose toward Max. The elderly woman stared in fascination as the 3 hamsters positioned themselves near the edge of the lawn, facing different directions as Max ate. They appeared to be standing guard. A blue jay landed on the lawn, hopping closer to investigate the food bowl. Immediately, one of the hamsters emitted a sharp squeak. Max's head jerked up, instantly alert, and the bird flew off in alarm. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Thompson whispered. The hamsters were acting as sentries while the dog ate, just as he evidently protected them at other times. Over the next week, Mrs. Thompson observed the unusual family whenever she could. She noticed how the hamsters would take turns watching for danger while the others foraged or played. She saw how Max responded instantly to their warning squeaks, and how the hamsters, in turn, obeyed his low growls by racing for cover. It was an alliance unlike anything she had ever seen, a canine and 3 rodents, natural enemies in the wild, working together in perfect synchrony. The hamsters provided vigilance with their superior hearing, while Max offered protection with his size and strength. One evening, as storms threatened again, Mrs. Thompson made a decision. She couldn't leave this remarkable family exposed to the elements any longer. Setting a shallow cardboard box near the shed, she filled it with soft towels and retreated to watch from her kitchen window. Initially, Max circled the box suspiciously. One of the hamsters, the boldest one, approached the box first, disappearing inside. After a moment, it emerged and seemed to communicate something to Max. To her delight, Max eventually nudged the other hamsters toward the box before squeezing himself into the small shelter as much as possible, his body partially shielding the opening from the coming rain. "That settles it," Mrs. Thompson said, reaching for her phone. "Time to make some arrangements." As rain began to patter against the windows, she dialed her veterinarian's number. This unusual family had demonstrated an unspoken alliance that transcended natural instincts. Now it was her turn to join that alliance and ensure they never had to face the elements alone again. August brought both blessings and challenges for the unusual family. Mrs. Thompson had transformed her garden shed into a proper shelter for Max and his hamster companions. A dog door allowed Max freedom to come and go, while inside, a comfortable dog bed occupied one corner, and a multilevel hamster habitat filled another. Dr. Wilson, the veterinarian, had been skeptical when Mrs. Thompson first described the bond between the golden retriever and the hamsters. "Dogs are predators, and hamsters are prey animals. This kind of relationship is unheard of." But upon witnessing the interaction herself, The veterinarian was amazed. "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anything like it," she admitted, watching as the hamsters scampered around Max, completely at ease. Though Mrs. Thompson had offered Max a place inside her home, he refused to leave his charges overnight. The best compromise was the shed, which provided protection while allowing the family to maintain their independence. For Max, these improvements brought comfort but also new challenges. Part of him, the part that remembered family life before his abandonment, yearned for human companionship. Mrs. Thompson was kind, offering treats and affection whenever he approached her. The craving for human touch, for the sense of belonging to a home again, grew stronger each day. Yet another part of him remained fiercely protective of his hamster family and the freedom they required. They couldn't live in a human house with its confined spaces and potential dangers. His loyalty to the tiny creatures who depended on him wrestled constantly with his longing for human connection. This internal struggle manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. Some days, Max would accept Mrs. Thompson's invitation to come inside for a brief visit. Other days, he would keep his distance, watching her warily as if she represented a threat to his independence. The hamsters sensed Max's conflict, responding with uncharacteristic nervousness on the days when his mood darkened. They would stay closer to their habitat, venturing out less frequently. Their trust remained absolute, but they seemed to understand that something was troubling him. Mrs. Thompson noticed the change as well. "Something's bothering our golden boy," she remarked to Dr. Wilson. "It's like he's torn between two worlds." "It's a unique situation," the veterinarian replied. "He's formed a family bond with the hamsters, but his instinct as a domesticated dog is to form connections with humans too. The conflicting pulls might be causing him stress." Finding balance proved increasingly difficult as August wore on. The neighborhood children had noticed the unusual arrangement in Mrs. Thompson's yard. Word spread quickly about the dog who thinks he's a hamster dad, and curious visitors began appearing, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unlikely family. Max found the attention deeply unsettling. His protective instincts went into overdrive, and he began restricting the hamsters' outdoor time, keeping them confined to the shed during periods of high human activity. This made the normally adventurous rodents restless and irritable. Peanut, always the boldest, started testing boundaries, making daring escapes when Max was distracted. Twice, Mrs. Thompson had to intervene when the adventurous hamster ventured dangerously close to the street. Max's anxiety increased with each incident, his sleep becoming fitful as he tried to maintain constant vigilance. The strain began to show physically. Max's coat lost some of its luster, and Mrs. Thompson noticed he was eating less than usual. The responsibility of protecting his unusual family while navigating his conflicting desires was taking its toll. One humid afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, Mrs. Thompson found Max pacing anxiously around the yard. The hamsters were presumably safe in their habitat inside the shed. But Max's behavior was concerning. He moved restlessly, as if anticipating a threat. Following his gaze toward the street, Mrs. Thompson suddenly understood. A car had pulled up, an unfamiliar sedan with out-of-state plates. A family was inside, a couple with 2 young children. "Are you sure this is the right address?" the woman asked. "The post said the dog was here." "That's what the message said," her husband replied. "Someone posted about a golden retriever living with hamsters, and it's gone viral." Mrs. Thompson felt a chill. Max's unusual family had become an internet sensation without their knowledge, and now strangers were showing up uninvited. For Max, already struggling with his protective duties and inner conflict, this new invasion of privacy would be unbearable. That evening, after politely but firmly turning away the visitors, Mrs. Thompson watched as Max performed his nightly routine of checking the yard's perimeter. The hamsters followed behind him in single file, alert to any signals from their protector. The coordination between them was still remarkable, but the strain in Max's movements was unmistakable. "This can't continue," Mrs. Thompson murmured. "He's wearing himself out trying to be everything to everyone." Her concerns deepened the following morning when she found Max standing guard at the shed entrance, his eyes bloodshot from apparent lack of sleep. Inside, the hamsters were unusually subdued, responding to their protector's stress with their own quieter demeanor. Mrs. Thompson made a decision. She placed a call to Dr. Wilson, then began making preparations. Max needed help, not just the physical comfort she'd provided with the improved shed, but a deeper solution to the conflict tearing him apart. The hamsters seemed to be adapting to Max's changing behavior. They had begun taking on more responsibility, standing sentinel for longer periods to allow Max brief rests. Butter had taken to grooming Max's face each evening, as if trying to comfort the troubled dog. Jelly kept a constant watch on Max's expressions and body language, alerting the others when their protector seemed particularly stressed. It was an unspoken alliance evolving under pressure, each member adjusting to support the others. But how long could it last? Max's struggle between his duty to the hamsters and his yearning for human connection was reaching a critical point. As evening fell and a new threat loomed on the horizon, one that would test their bond as never before, Mrs. Thompson looked out at the golden retriever sitting vigilantly beside the shed. "Hold on just a little longer," she whispered. "Help is coming. You don't have to face this alone anymore." The struggle of the hidden protector was reaching its climax, building toward a moment of truth that would determine the fate of this most unusual family. The first signs of trouble arrived with the changing leaves of early September. Reports began circulating throughout Maplewood about a group of raccoons that had moved into the area. Unlike the occasional solitary raccoon, these were operating as a coordinated unit, 5 strong, unusually aggressive, and apparently unafraid of humans. "They've completely ransacked my garage," Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, Mr. Grayson, complained one morning over the fence. "Animal control says they're overwhelmed with calls and can't get out here until next week." Mrs. Thompson nodded sympathetically, her eyes drifting to the shed where Max and the hamsters were resting. The raccoons represented exactly the kind of threat she'd been dreading: clever, determined predators that could easily target the hamsters if they discovered them. That evening, Mrs. Thompson watched Max lead the hamsters on their evening patrol of the yard's perimeter. Despite his exhaustion, the golden retriever maintained his protective routine with unwavering dedication. "Dr. Wilson will be here tomorrow morning," she said softly. "She's bringing someone who might be able to help." Just after midnight, Max jerked awake inside the shed. His ears perked forward, detecting the careful scraping of claws against wood, the soft chittering communication of predators on the hunt. The hamsters remained peacefully asleep, unaware of the danger approaching. Through the small dog entrance, he could see them, dark shapes moving across the yard, heading directly toward the shed. 5 raccoons, their eyes catching the moonlight as they advanced in formation. Max slipped outside, positioning himself between the approaching raccoons and the shed entrance. He made no sound yet, hoping his presence alone might deter them. But these raccoons, bold from successful raids throughout the neighborhood, merely paused briefly before continuing their advance. The largest raccoon, clearly the leader, chittered something to the others. They spread out, forming a semicircle around Max. Their strategy was evident. They would approach from multiple angles, overwhelming the solitary defender. Max's growl started low in his chest, a rumbling warning that vibrated the night air. The raccoons hesitated but didn't retreat. They were used to intimidating their way past obstacles. Inside the shed, Jelly awoke first, detecting Max's absence and the subtle vibration of his warning growl outside. With quick movements, Jelly roused the other two, communicating danger in their silent language. Mrs. Thompson stirred at the sound of Max's growl. It wasn't his usual warning bark. This was deeper, more serious. Something was wrong. Outside, the standoff was escalating. The lead raccoon had taken a bold step forward, testing Max's resolve. The golden retriever snapped in response, his protective instincts in full control. This wasn't about his inner conflict anymore. This was about defending his family. As the confrontation intensified, 3 small shapes emerged from the shed's dog door. Instead of hiding from danger, the hamsters had chosen to join their protector. What followed demonstrated the depth of their bond. Rather than staying behind Max for protection, the hamsters deployed themselves strategically around the yard. Peanut darted to the right, Butter to the left, while Jelly positioned directly behind the raccoons. As the lead raccoon lunged toward Max, Jelly let out a piercing squeak from behind. The sudden sound caused the raccoon to whirl around in confusion. That moment of distraction was all Max needed. With a powerful lunge, he drove the lead raccoon backward. The other raccoons began to reassess the situation. From her window, Mrs. Thompson watched in astonishment. The coordination between Max and the hamsters was nothing short of miraculous. Each time a raccoon would shift position to attack, one of the hamsters would create a distraction, allowing Max to maintain his defensive position. "Unbelievable," she whispered, quickly reaching for her phone to call Dr. Wilson. One raccoon darted forward, attempting to slip past Max toward the shed. Peanut raced toward the raccoon with a boldness that belied his tiny size. The hamster's unexpected charge toward the much larger predator was so contrary to natural behavior that it momentarily confused the raccoon. Max capitalized on the confusion with a series of sharp barks that began to drive the raccoons back. Their coordinated defense was working. The raccoons were finding this particular yard more trouble than it was worth. Mrs. Thompson, grabbing a flashlight and a broom, burst out her back door, shouting and waving the light. Her sudden appearance provided the final push the raccoons needed to retreat, scampering over the fence and disappearing into the night. In the aftermath, Max stood panting in the yard, the hamsters gathered around his paws in what could only be described as a victory huddle. "You did it," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "All of you together." For the first time, Max didn't back away from her approach. Instead, he stood his ground, the hamsters still clustered around him, as if presenting his family to her at last. The barrier that had kept him torn between two worlds seemed to have dissolved. By morning, Dr. Wilson arrived with her colleague, a specialist in animal behavior. What they found was a transformed situation. Max was resting on the porch, the hamsters nestled against him, while Mrs. Thompson sat nearby in quiet companionship. "Something's changed," Dr. Wilson observed. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "The raccoons came last night. They fought them off together, Max and the hamsters, working as a team. Over the following weeks, Max, no longer torn between his loyalty to the hamsters and his longing for human connection, found a balance that seemed to satisfy both needs. With Mrs. Thompson's help, they established a new routine. During the day, Max and the hamsters had free run of the backyard, with the hamsters often riding on Max's back. In the evenings, all four would come inside, the hamsters in a secure enclosure that allowed them to see and interact with Max, who would settle on a plush bed near Mrs. Thompson's chair. "It's not about instinct," Mrs. Thompson explained to a group of visitors. "It's about connection. Max and these hamsters chose to see past their differences and protect each other. That's a kind of love we could all learn from." On a golden October afternoon, Mrs. Thompson captured a photograph that would eventually hang in her living room. It showed not four separate creatures, but a single family unit, bonded not by blood but by choice, by shared experiences, and by an affection that transcended natural boundaries. The tiny hamsters who had lost their mother, and the dog who had lost his home had found something far more precious than what they had lost, an unbreakable bond that would continue to touch the hearts of all who witnessed it.